Welcome back to It's Just ADHD, and today we are going to be tackling a very important question that has been dividing the Netflix viewership for years now, which is whether or not Francesca Bridgerton is autistic. The question first arose when she really had her big debut in season 3. We got to see a lot of her in the episodes of the Netflix show Bridgerton. A lot of autistic people were like, hey, she's autistic. And a lot of non-autistic people were like, no, she's just introverted. So we're going to be putting the question to bed, and we're going to be using a ton of research and neuroscience and stuff to discuss why this is the case. So if you're one of our regular viewers and you're not a Bridgerton fan or you've never seen the show, don't worry. This has so many studies jam-packed into this one episode. I think this is probably the most research dense of any episode we've ever done so far. So you're going to learn a ton. So definitely stick around. This will still be worthwhile. And if this is your first time tuning into our channel and you're just a Bridgerton fan, thank you so much for joining us. I'm so stoked to be nerding out with you about Bridgerton for what is going to be a very long episode. I already know it. One quick note before we get started. This show is not medical advice. I'm not your doctor. And so if anything in here feels kind of medical and like something that you want to look more into, go talk about that with your doctor. Don't do that with us. We're not your doctor. All right, let's get into it. So the showrunners obviously have opinions here, right? Let's hear what they have to say.
This is a show about people, and it's really important that everybody sees themselves represented on that screen.
I read an interview with Julia Quinn, and she said she didn't write Francesca as an autistic character, but it's had a lot of feedback from autistic fans saying they can relate to her. And I just wondered, did you had any of that sort of reaction, and what does that mean to you?
We definitely did last season, and the writers kind of said that it was something that they did discuss in the writers' room. It wasn't something that me or Victor were aware of, which is really interesting that it must have just been in the page, and that's kind of how it came out in our performances. It wasn't something that them as characters would have been aware of in those times, so it wasn't something that we felt like we needed to really like sort of put too much pressure on, but acknowledge the maybe feeling slightly different to your siblings and how like society is going about, and if that's not fitting like quite right with you.
Okay, so that was from an interview with the BBC, and that is the actress who plays Francesca. So basically, to recap, the original author of the Bridgerton book series did not necessarily write Francesca as autistic, but then when the writers for the Netflix adaptation were reading the book, they felt like Francesca might be some flavor of neurodivergent, and they did discuss that, but they did not tell the actor who plays her husband or her that she was potentially portraying an autistic character. And so I think this is kind of actually very cool that they still ended up picking up these very subtle mannerisms that we're going to talk about later that are very characteristically autistic. So how could that happen, right? Well, actors and actresses obviously have to root their characters in real people, and their craft is essentially being able to observe humans and be really good mimics of humans. And so I would guess that this actress has autistic people in her life, potentially autistic women who are undiagnosed, and she must have her brain must have made the connection that those individuals reminded her of Francesca and the way that Francesca was written. And so she kind of subconsciously or consciously, I'm not an actor, I don't know, baked in those mannerisms. So I think that that's really cool, and it really speaks to like the artistry of how this was made. But let's actually start talking about the show itself. So here is a very early scene.
Francesca, look where you are, dear. Francesca? Francesca? There's no need to shout.
So in this scene, we see her not responding to her own name because she's so fixated on her favorite hobby, which is playing the piano. And that's how she's decompressing before a really, really big day, which is when you're going to present to the queen and be introduced into society as potentially able to be married for the first time. just a note, like this is a very common way for autistic people to decompress when they're stressed is to use their special interests. We're going to be talking a lot more about special interests a little bit later here. But yeah, so this is a common thing. And the notable aspect is that we see her not responding to her own name. This is a very autistic trait. There's research on it. There's a lot of research on it in children. That's actually one of the flags where, when they talk about diagnosing like 1-year-olds, 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds with autism, that's one of those flags that parents will go in and see doctors. But this also persists into adulthood, which is the study that I wanted to mention. Is this study from Ghent University from 2018? They show that adults with autism also show a diminished brain response to hearing their own name. So it's not just children, it persists into adulthood. And so they were, scanning autistic adults and they just didn't see it light up the same way that you see for neurotypicals when they hear their own name. Our brains are just kind of focused on other things, especially when you're fixated on like a special interest or something else. And that goes into the theory of monotropism, which again, we're going to be talking about a little bit later. So this is just a very characteristically autistic trait. And we are 2 minutes into the first episode of her season. All right, another thing that I want to show you.
It is your debut, Francesca. Are you not excited?
I suppose entering society means I might meet someone. Would be pleasant to have my own house.
You are only a week back from Bath and already you are eager to escape us.
No, I simply could use some peace.
So I think it's funny. She consistently throughout the show, when they're like, what's your motivation for getting married? It's not love. It's so that she can get out of the house and find peace and quiet. But her family members are very consistently confused by her emotional reactions or lack thereof in these very otherwise stressful situations. She doesn't really show the stress. And so I wanted to also talk to you guys about this other study that just came out less than a month ago, which is pretty cool. And it's new research that shows emotional expressions work differently in autism. And so what they did is they had autistic people and non-autistic people show happy, sad, angry, like go through all these emotions, and they were tracking their faces. And they found that the facial movements in autistic people and non-autistic people are completely different. And so this is a really big study that helps to support the theory of the double empathy problem. So for those of you that haven't heard of it before, basically autism research for all of forever was always about how autistic people have deficits. Autistic people can't read everybody else. But then what we started to find, and this was more when we got actual autistic researchers doing research on autism as opposed to non-autistic researchers doing research on autism. So when the autistic researchers started to look into it, they were like, oh, wait, neurotypical people, like non-autistic people, can't read our facial expressions either. It's bi-directional. And what's more is that autistic people don't typically have impairments with reading each other's facial expressions. So it really is like speaking two different languages. You would never say that when two people are speaking to each other in Spanish, that they have a deficit because they don't understand English, right? And so that's kind of what this study is supporting, is that autistic people simply express emotions somewhat differently on their faces. And that's why we don't always read neurotypicals correctly, and neurotypicals don't always read us correctly. So very cool study. Go check it out. Brand new, really exciting. More support for the double empathy theory about it being a bi-directional issue as opposed to like a deficit for autistic individuals. All right. And then I also am going to be peppering in clips from Professor Tony Atwood. So he has been an autism clinician and an autism researcher for like 40 years. Some people love him. Some people are not a huge fan. Certainly when you've been around for that long, like some of the early research is going to be a little bit more problematic. But I think that as opposed to some of the other autism researchers, looking at you, Simon Baron-Cohen, and we are going to be discussing Simon Baron-Cohen later, Tony has done a better job of like adapting to the times, and he has a really good talk about how autism can present in women. And so that's the talk that I have clipped for you guys to be able to listen to little snippets from. But I highly recommend, we'll have a link to his full talk in the notes section of this episode. So I highly recommend, if this resonates, go listen to the whole talk. He's got lots of fun, anecdotes that I had to cut out for time. So here's him talking about autistic emotions, and it's why it's hard for neurotypicals not only to see it in our faces, but also for us to verbalize our emotions to neurotypicals.
What I want ultimately is psychotherapy designed by Aspies for Aspies, administered by Aspies, because their biggest challenge is look at me and tell me, what were you feeling at that time? Don't know. What are you feeling now? I don't know. I shall now complete the sentence. I don't know how to grasp the many negative thoughts and emotions in my mind. Hold one, label it, and explain it in speech so that you will understand. So the person has very great difficulty in disclosing inner thoughts and feelings.
And he uses the term Aspie. This is an older talk from a medical conference. I think it was from 2015. And so in 2013, the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual, it used to have Asperger's and autism separated out as two different conditions. Asperger's referring to people that were lower support needs. They combined it all into one thing, and they have support level 1, 2, and 3. And so people formerly with Asperger's would now be considered autistic with support need level 1. So that's why he still uses that term. Part of why it was phased out was because Hans Asperger, the guy that it was named after, was a Nazi, and he did some very cruel research on autistic children. And so it doesn't really feel right to name the condition after him. But it's also very hard for people who were diagnosed with Asperger's to then adapt new labels because, they're like, I was Asperger's, now I'm autism. And so you'll sometimes still hear that term used by people on the internet and stuff like that. So just to kind of get into the Aspie versus autism linguistic differences. So you'll hear him use Aspie in this older presentation. All right. So Francesca not only struggles with understanding or with hearing her own name and understanding the emotions of her family members and vice versa, she also kind of struggles with social situations.
And you, Miss Francesca?
Someone kind, I suppose.
Well, that is plain. Do you not want someone unkind?
No, of course not.
So the video clips that I took for this from YouTube, I absolutely love. It's just a video of Francesca being autistic for 7 minutes, and so they label where she missed certain social cues. But what's interesting about this scene is that she didn't really fully understand the question. The girls are talking about what do they want in a future husband, and so they're all listing off all these traits, and she takes it very literally. She's like, I want someone that's kind, and they're like, well, isn't that basic? And so she just didn't really understand this interaction with the other girls from her town. And the research that I want to highlight for this is that autistic communication works very well. It's very similar to the facial expressions. Autistics are very good at communicating with each other. And obviously non-autistics are very good at communicating with each other. But when you have mixed groups, that's where breakdowns start to happen. And so this is kind of a classic study where, again, supports that double empathy problem, where they basically played a game of telephone. And so they had groups where it was 8 allistic people, allistic meaning not autistic, and then 8 autistic people, and then groups where it was 4 and 4. And so they'd have the first person relay a story to the second person would relay the story to the third person, and so on. And they would track how many little details got missed as the story kept going down the chain, and where did the breakdowns happen. And so when it's the purely autistic group, their communication ability for these stories is on par with the non-autistic group, and even at certain points better than the non-autistic group. We are very detail-oriented people, so it's no surprise that we were able to remember and communicate details effectively with each other. But in the mixed group, a ton of details got missed and the story kind of morphed over time. And so it really shows that it's a bi-directional communication gap. It's not a deficit because autistic people are highly capable of effective communication when it's just among our own kind. But when it's mixed, we start to have problems. And so we see that on display with Francesca, with all the neurotypicals in the town. She's really having trouble keeping up with their social situations. And we'll hear from Professor Atwood again.
Now, a risk in ASD is making social faux pas or mistakes. These kids are self-appointed revealers of the truth, and they will spot your mistakes and point out your mistake, and you should be grateful to them for your mistake being pointed out. So they have that natural ability. But if a boy makes a social mistake, he gets upset, explosive, annoying, abrasive, he's referred. Whereas a girl will make a social mistake. Oh, I'm so sorry I talked about your BMI. Yes, I do know you need to go on a diet, and I am very concerned about you, Auntie. But when you put those potato chips in the... and when your face went red, I didn't know whether it was embarrassment or menopause, etc. And I'm so sorry I've upset you. But because she apologizes, we forgive and forget. But the point is, she didn't know, but she's got a remarkable way of recovery. Or she appeases people by, Mum may arrange a birthday party and says to her, it's a birthday party with your cousins. You've not known your cousins for many years. They're almost strangers to you. Will you be okay? Yes. Now, you sure? Because I will be away with your brother because I've got to take him to soccer. You'll be on your own for 3 hours. Will you be okay? Yes. But look at the terror in her eyes. She won't let on, and she's incredibly brave to cope with it. The boys will either do oppositional defiant disorder, which is a pompous way of saying you won't do as he's told. But psychologists and psychiatrists won't say that because people could understand it. So she apologizes and appeases, or she's like a chameleon and she adopts a persona to fit the situation.
Yeah, so this is very common for autistic women, and this is why we don't get caught clinically, right? Because we are constantly trying to adapt and cover up. And certainly we do commit social faux pas, but we try and smooth it over and apologize and do whatever you have to. And you learn so quickly, like, oh my God, that was wrong. Why was that wrong? And you think about it over and over. So we adapt and we blend in. And so then when you go into clinical setting and they're trying to get diagnosed, clinicians are like, there's nothing different about her. She's very social. She seems very normal. And they don't understand the cognitive load that's going into appearing normal at all times. And we kind of adopt these personas and go on autopilot and don't really necessarily even cognitively know that we're doing it sometimes because it's just so ingrained, because you get so much negative reinforcement, like we saw with Francesca, where all the girls kind of made weird faces at her and acted weird because she didn't answer the correct way. Which, by the way, I feel like wanting a kind partner is that's a very good trait to want. I don't even know that I understand why that was the wrong answer. But you get so much negative reinforcement that you learn quickly, like, okay, that was the wrong answer. Let's try again. So that's why we get these chameleon personas. Another thing you notice from that scene is that she does not make a lot of eye contact with that group of women. So this study, I actually did not know about this going into constructing the notes for this episode. I thought this was so cool. So eye contact avoidance in autism stems from abnormal sensitivity of the brain's threat processing system. Because they've always wondered, why don't autistic people make eye contact? And there's kind of some wacky theories that it's because we don't care about people as much, or don't care about socializing as much. And that's kind of, again, more from that Simon Baron-Cohen side of the world and his research that has really messed up things for autistic women in a very damaging way. But no, it's none of that. So what they have found is the amygdala activates quite a lot when autistic people look at eyes. And that's the part of the brain that processes fear response. It's one of the more primitive parts of the brain. And it forms fear-based memories. It's a very important part of the brain, right? It teaches you, hey, don't go near that bear. It'll chase you. Don't go near that trap. Don't go, like amygdala is really important for survival. But we seem to have potentially higher connectivity in that region. And so when we see eyes, we register it as a threat-based response. And so that could be one reason why sometimes we're able to make a little bit more eye contact with like family members, loved ones, is that there's some level of understanding that like these are not scary eyes, these are not threatening. But you think about in certain animals and stuff, eye contact is threatening, right? And so for whatever reason, autistic people seem to be more wired to and more sensitive to registering that as a threat. And so that's why it's so overwhelming when you make eye contact is like your amygdala is firing off and going like, oh my God, oh my God. So this was such a cool study because it really shows why we have these particular mannerisms. And also just to note, it shows why. So there are certain like interventions that people will do on younger kids to try and get them to make more eye contact. And it shows why this is like, that's really uncomfortable, right? Like you're making them do something that is literally triggering the fear part of the brain. So probably not a very effective intervention for children because, that's intense and scary. All right. So let's watch a scene where Francesca is confronted by her suitors. Her many
Miss Francesca, tell us, what are your hobbies?
I play the pianoforte.
That is magnificent. And your other interests?
Pianoforte does take up a great deal of my time.
Oh, I think what life means to say is, who are you besides your hobbies? Yes. What do you desire? What do you despise? What makes you tick?
I think my brother needs me. If you would excuse me. One moment.
Okay, so in this scene, pianoforte is part of her personality. Like that's what she likes to do, and that's kind of a much bigger part of her life than it might be for a neurotypical, right? So this goes to the theory of monotropism. And I'm not going to dive into this super, super deeply because we actually have a separate episode called like why do you have special interests? What causes special interests? I don't remember the exact language in the title, but we go into monotropism in that episode in a lot more depth. But basically, for years and years, again, Simon Baron-Cohen and some of these other researchers have talked about like autistic people have theory of mind deficits and the problem with that research. And we talk in great detail about one of the tests that he designed and administered in the eyes test episode. Like it's the weirdest autism test ever created. Autistic people in every single one of these studies that he runs, some chunk of the autistic people will pass the theory of mind tests. And so it's like he keeps trying to describe it as like the universal explanation for what causes autism, but that by definition is wrong because some autistic people always pass. And just to kind of explain briefly why some autistic people fail at higher rates is because they found that it often correlates more strongly with language processing abilities. So like if you're dyslexic, you're going to struggle a lot more or have some other form of learning disability, which of course is a lot more common as a comorbidity with autistic people than with other people. So he's probably catching learning disabilities with his theory of mind tests in very convoluted ways. So as a counter theory, again, you got actual autistic researchers who started to look into it and they developed the theory of monotropism. Monotropism, the idea is that your brain as an autistic individual really wants to focus on one thing at a time and focus very deeply and very intensely. And ADHD people are also monotropic. And if you have both ADHD and autism, you will actually score the highest on the monotropism tests because these are available for free online if you are curious and want to take it. Not currently a way to diagnose, but it is a very new test, and it wouldn't surprise me if at some point it does become diagnostically valid. But we're just not there yet. There's not been enough rigorous research for it to be accepted as like a diagnostic. So your brain wants to really focus singularly on one particular thing, and that's at the expense of all the other things. That's why autistic people are able to really fixate on their special interests in great depth, but you might forget to go to the bathroom, or that you need to drink water, or that you need to eat, and you might not hear your name being called, and you might not notice that you're actually very cold and you need to go turn up the heat. Like, you don't notice all these external cues because the brain is focused on that one thing. And then if you suddenly become aware that you're hungry, your body is only focused on that one thing. And so that's how the autistic brain kind of navigates through life, is being very intensely focused at one particular thing at any given time, with an intensity that is much greater than someone who is non-autistic, who may be able to sort of focus and take in inputs from multiple things at a time, but not at the same volume. It's kind of like the non-autistic people have 3 televisions going at once, but the volume is a lot lower. And the autistic person only can turn on 1 television at once, but the volume is like cranked up to 100. So that's monotropism, and it is a very compelling theory for autism that tends to be a lot more well respected within the autistic community than the theory of mind research, partly because the theory of mind research is bad research, and also because a lot of us actually do feel like monotropism makes more sense. So I also wanted to note another thing. People seem to not understand what common special interests are. There's very much this stereotype that special interests for autistic people are like trains and stuff. And like, listen, I love a good train. I hear you. I feel you. I love public transit as much as the next autistic person. But part of that misconception is because of the way that autism research is distributed. So the funds for autism research, 98% of it go to researching children and 2% go to researching adults. So certainly there are adults who have trains or stuff like that as a special interest. But that's also just going to be a more common interest of children in general. And so it can sometimes kind of create misconceptions about what types of special interests perpetuate into adulthood for autistic individuals. And so this is a study that I really liked, which again, we go over it in our episode on special interests, because this one, they actually researched adults, which is very rare in autism research. And so what they found is the number one special interest of autistic adults is autism. That's why most of you are here listening to me right now, because you also have a special interest in autism, just like me. Number 2 is computers and gaming, and we don't think of that, right? Like when you think of like the people, and that one in particular is significantly more common in men than in women. So when you think of the guy that's like on the computer all the time, loves building their own PCs, loves playing all these games, really can hyperfixate on it, really good on it, knows all these specs about computers, that doesn't always trigger like autism for people in their minds. And certainly an interest in PCs is not enough to be diagnosed on autism alone. I believe the stats on some of the other studies I was reading said that actually neurotypicals, 30% of them have what you would consider special interest, but then over 90% of autistic individuals have a special interest. I do wonder sometimes, though, you're going to see later with the diagnostic criteria how certain people accidentally get excluded from autism diagnoses. So I do wonder sometimes if there are autistic people in that like neurotypical control group. Anyway, what I wanted to show you on this one is that music and bands, while it is a more common special interest for autistic men, it is number 3. It's incredibly common. And so I think people don't think of Francesca's special interest in pianoforte as being a common special interest, but it actually is. It's actually an incredibly common special interest. The other ones that are up there are nature and gardening, arts and culture, science, religion, movies, TV shows, celebrities. So you go down the list. I mean, where even is public transit on here? Gosh, yeah, it's actually very far down. Again, if you are a person whose special interest is public transit, like that's awesome. Like trains are awesome. I feel you. I wouldn't say I have a special interest in trains, but I still super appreciate public transit. But that's sort of the stereotype we get from television and stuff, and it's based off of a lot of research on younger kids. So yeah, psychology is another very, very common special interest for like adult women. Psychology, autism, nature, gardening, art, animals, all very common for adult women with autism. And then another thing I wanted to call out from this scene is that she kind of seems to struggle to recall information about herself. And part of that is maybe not necessarily in that particular situation, but in general, autistic people have worse autobiographical memory. And so that's the ability to remember information about yourself. So research shows that for both children and adults, it's a lot harder for you to have detailed narratives about yourself. It's a lot more difficult for you to recall information about yourself, and you tend to have gaps and have compensatory strategies. So this is really interesting because we are often very, very good at storing factual information. And so the question arises, is that actually a compensatory strategy? Because perhaps these are separate parts of the brain, right? So perhaps the part of the brain that is responsible for autobiographical memory has less connectivity or something like that. And so our like detail-oriented part of the brain, factual part of the brain, becomes sort of overly developed. And that's the thing that you see with like dyslexia, for example. The traditional reading centers of the brain are a little bit underdeveloped. That's the pathogenesis of dyslexia. So then you see other parts of the brain, like the visual spatial components, becoming overly developed to allow them to still read, although less efficiently than the parts of the brain that are meant for that. But that also makes them typically score better on like visual spatial tasks because that other part of the brain, just like a muscle, is getting worked out a lot more. This is a really interesting finding that perhaps this is one of the reasons why we have such fantastic detail-oriented memories about kind of other things. So just wanted to call that out. But that also contributes to, a lot of autistic people have a poor sense of self. And so that might be part of the reason why, is because we literally can't recall memories about ourselves. And so you can imagine it's harder to construct a narrative about yourself over time if you are kind of like missing certain memories about yourself. So I think we see that a little bit in play with her when they're asking questions about herself. She's like, I don't know. I don't know what you're talking about. I think very common experience for autistic folks in conversation. That also might be partly why, uh, sometimes we'll like story swap and stuff, but we don't always converse in the way where it's like, how are you? I am good. How are you? And like have questions back and forth at one another. There's very interesting stuff about the way that there are linguistic differences in autistic versus non-autistic conversations. And I do wonder if the struggles with autobiographical memory play a role in that. All right. And then the other thing I wanted to call out is autistic women are at a lot higher risk for being exploited in romantic relationships. So not necessarily saying that that's what was going on in that scene, but I think it's a really important thing to share with you guys. It's a well-documented phenomenon that we tend to be a little bit more vulnerable. So let's play the clip on that.
But it's the vulnerability. They're not good at understanding character. They don't have a group of friends to go out with who are good at character judgments for the good guys and the bad guys. They are intoxicated by the interest of the boys, and the risk for this group is date rape. They didn't read the signals, low self-esteem, etc. Not recognizing that boys may be flirting and knowing how to respond. Sex has never interested me. I have never felt sexy and certainly never wanted to look sexy or glamorous. Even as a teenager, I felt left out because my peers were becoming sexually aware and I felt nothing. Many of the girls with Asperger's become romantically sexually aware about 5 to 10 years later than their peer group. And because they're not interested in the boys, they're accused of being gay. And then they become totally confused in terms of gender identity and sexuality.
Yeah, so just general struggles with dating. If you're an autistic woman or autistic in general, I don't think it's easy for anyone who's autistic. But autistic women are at pretty high risk for being exploited. And then, so after she has this conversation with the guys, she dips. She's out, and she needs a moment alone.
You really ought to take to the floor again.
Ought I?
Once one finds oneself on the wall, it is difficult to come off it, no matter what one does.
At least the wall is not asking what makes me tick.
Did you not enjoy conversing with those gentlemen?
I expected conversation. I did not expect to be inspected as if I were some rare insect writhing under a microscope.
You do not much like attracting notice, do you?
Not really. No.
Yeah, so this is a thing that has been discussed a lot more on the internet lately. So this is a article from a licensed social worker talking about the fear of being perceived in neurodivergent people. So that's kind of the language that autistic people use a lot, is the fear of being perceived. So it's kind of where you're hyper aware of other people noticing you and noticing details about you. I think the best way I can explain it for what it feels like with me is the way that you would, the sensation you would feel if you were on a reality television show and it's like the first day and you know that camera crews are following you all around, but you're like supposed to act natural and you're like, oh God, but everybody's watching me. And how are my comments going to be interpreted? Are they going to clip this weird and it's going to sound like I'm saying something offensive when I wasn't intending to do that? That kind of hypervigilance that you would have. And I think people on reality shows say some wild stuff. I've never been on a reality show, but I have to imagine they kind of must sort of get used to the cameras over time and forget that they're there, because otherwise I cannot fathom why people say and do the things they do on television. But like, imagine that first day feeling where you're like, oh, there's cameras everywhere, and just knowing that you're being filmed. That's what it feels like for me. And so I think that that's a very common phenomenon in other autistic individuals, however they might describe it manifesting for them. We often refer to it as the fear of being perceived. And again, Professor Atwood was aware of this in like 2015.
ASD level 1, etc., is the same as Asperger's syndrome, but it's the invisible end of the spectrum. The girls are there, but they don't want to be noticed. So they fly under the radar by their coping and camouflaging mechanisms of observation and imitation. And they do that before they make the first step. There's a pathological fear of making a mistake. So that girl will be on the periphery of play, but avidly watching what's going on. Now, one of the essential components of ASD is a difficulty understanding the thoughts, feelings, and intentions of others, reading body language. And if you're not good at working out what someone's thinking and feeling, how do you get that information? By reading fiction. Because in the text is very clearly what someone is thinking and feeling. Or if she doesn't have a group that she's included in, she's on the periphery, she's poor in the currency of friendship, nobody wants to know you or include you. How do you find out about people? You watch soap operas of Home and Away and Neighbours. In a voyeuristic way, you can then watch, you can replay it, freeze it, understand it, and then become one of the central characters. And you realize in her speech, she's using borrowed phrases from television.
Yeah, so I think this makes a lot of sense to me. The fear of being perceived probably comes from having negative reinforcements your entire life. If you make a comment in school and you're in the first grade and a kid turns around and goes like, hey, that's so weird, or, makes some sort of comment, and you have this happen over and over and over, of course it would be natural over time to really feel like all eyes are on you at all times, because you're kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop. Like, when is someone going to tell me I made another social misstep? When is someone going to tell me that that was bad or wrong? So it makes sense that you would start to kind of get a little bit hypervigilant. And he also touches on another really important thing, is that a lot of autistic women want to compensate, and could these be sex-based differences? Maybe. I think it's a little bit more societal-based differences. I think there are higher expectations for women to get along socially, and we often get more corrections. This is well documented. We get more corrections than the men do. And so how do you adapt to that? Well, you kind of become a wallflower, right? You don't want to be out front and center of attention, because that's where everybody's going to see you making mistakes, right? And then you observe, you look, and you see what do those other kids say? Why are they not getting yelled at? Like, how are they communicating? What are they joking about? What are their mannerisms? How are they making friends? And so when you kind of observe over time, you learn, you're learning this at a very young age. You learn how to fit in by power of observation. And autistic people are very famously good at pattern matching and puzzles and that type of thing. And it's just one giant pattern match, isn't it? Like figuring out what are the social rules and like manually reconstructing it in your mind. So speaking of being good at like patterns and systems, let's watch Francesca.
Francesca, dearest, Lord Petrie is quite the music devotee, and I hear accomplished on the cello as well.
The cello is such a beautiful instrument.
Indeed. What music do you most love?
Lately, I have been enjoying Ries. His piano trios are quite beautiful. And Beethoven's Appassionata. I could listen to it forever.
That is quite expressive music. I once heard a rumor the trio was written to convey his feelings for Mademoiselle Ludwig's. Do you not think you can feel it in the music?
I mostly enjoy the chord progressions.
So, I think this is just such an autistic interaction. Oh my God. So, okay, they're both interested in music, right? But this sort of showcases the difference between maybe a sort of more neurotypical interest or I'll say a non-hyper fixation, because certainly autistic people can be interested in non-systemizing ways in content as well. So we don't know if this guy is autistic or not. He doesn't get a ton of screen time, but he doesn't have a hyper fixation or a special interest on music. But Francesca, the qualities of her interests are really different. The gentleman suitor is in it because he feels the emotion and he cares about the sort of who wrote this song and why did they write it. Francesca is interested in it because she cares a lot about the chord progressions. And so this is a very systemizing way to approach music. And so, the study that I have here among children with autism, special interests often reflect exceptional abilities such as systemizing and heightened attention to detail. We'll see that even more in some of the future clips. She really notices fine details about the music. And the special interests of children with autism frequently occur in systemizable domains such as mechanical, collectible, natural, and numerical systems. So music is in many ways very similar to mathematics, and it's very much what they're referring to as a systemizable domain. It really lends itself to systemizing. So that's, potentially why her brain kind of latched onto it, is there's a whole lot of like meaty stuff to get into. I don't think that, it's as common to have special interests in things that don't have rich histories or interesting ways to categorize or things like that. You kind of need something to sink your claws into and spend a while in. I also want to point out they talk in a lot of these studies about autistic people having collections, right? And I want to clarify that does not always mean a physical collection. I'm guilty. I had rock collections growing up, so I did have physical collections of pretty rocks and geodes and stuff. And when I used to go and buy them, people thought that I was into them for like their spiritual properties, and I'm like, I just like rocks. I think rocks are cool. But a collection can be a collection of facts, right? Like storing a bunch of facts in your mind, that is a collection too. And I think that sometimes gets missed when they talk about autistic people having collections, right? We don't think of it as mental collections. So, all right.
Who shall you dance with first, sister? Perhaps I shall go alphabetically.
So this is another example of her being very sort of systemized, right? They're asking, who do you want to dance with? Expecting an answer about like, well, I like this guy better than this guy. And she's like, I'll go alphabetically. And her family is just so confused by that answer. So systemizing research is very interesting. This is an area that has been done by Simon Baron-Cohen. So Simon Baron-Cohen, similar to Professor Atwood, has been in the autism world for forever, decades and decades of research. He is the head of like the autism research department at Cambridge University, and he got knighted for his profound contributions to the autistic community. I don't think that his contributions are so good. And a lot of other people who are autistic and kind of get into it also very much disagree with a lot of his stuff. So he is the one who wrote the AQ, which is the autism quotient. That's the standard test that they use for diagnosis. And he has some very wacky theories about what causes autism. So one of them is the empathy and systemizing quotient, and another one is extreme male brain theory. So just to talk about extreme male brain theory real quick, one of the ways, so he thinks that autistic brains are a manifestation of the extreme male masculine brain. Now, modern neuroscience doesn't support this. Like, you can't look at a brain scan and go, that's a male brain, that's a female brain. It's very much a patchwork of what you might call stereotypically masculine or feminine parts, if you can even really call it that. Like, it modern neuroscience does not really gender the brain anymore because there's just research doesn't support that. But he developed this theory a long time ago and he is sticking with it. And he also uses other things like the lack of women in STEM fields to prove his point, which, as a woman in a STEM field, we very much get pushed out by harassment. So, that's a pretty big confounding variable to his theory. But to prove his theory, he took the fluids from pregnant women, like the amniotic fluid, tested it, and found that in mothers who would go on to have autistic children, the testosterone levels were higher. And so he uses this as evidence like, oh, the extra testosterone, that's why an autistic brain developed on this kid. Even if it's a woman, that's a woman with a man brain, so goes his theory. So can you guys think of a reason why that study might not actually be valid? Well, it's because, throwing out my own theory, perhaps these autistic individuals had autistic mothers. Autism famously has an awful lot of comorbidities. And for autistic women, those comorbidities can include things like dysmenorrhea, which is painful periods. It can include PCOS. It can include endometriosis. There are so many conditions that are hormone disrupting that occur in autistic women at significantly higher rates than the general population. And so if these individuals had autistic mothers, and we know autism is highly, highly genetic, it perhaps they have conditions that would make testosterone rise during pregnancy. And so really his test may have been on the bodily changes of autistic mothers more so than some sort of trait that like causes autism in the brain after birth. So keep that in mind when you read some of his studies. At first it might sound compelling, but like always try and think of alternative explanations because some of his stuff is really wacky. So anyway, this guy thinks that autism is man brains. You really see that reflected in his work. So, like I said, he wrote the AQ. That is kind of that and RADS are the two like main autism tests that doctors are going to use to diagnose. Ideally, they would also be doing other background and behavioral checks, but AQ and RADS tend to be also very big parts of those. And AQ was written by him. And so his other theory is the empathy and systemizing quotient. And basically, he believes that systemizing and the ability to have empathy are at two ends of the spectrum, and it is a binary trait. And so if you have a lot of empathy, you cannot possibly be good at systemizing. If you are good at systemizing, you cannot possibly have empathy. And he believes that autistic people exist very far down on the systemizing end of that binary spectrum. So this is obviously, harmful stereotype for all autistic people because it tells the world that we don't have empathy, and that is not the case. One of the things that really, really drives me nuts is there are actually different types of empathy in the psychology field. So there is cognitive empathy. That's the ability to basically recognize emotions in other people. Like, you can look at someone and be like, they're sad. They're obviously sad. Certainly, autistic people may have deficits in cognitive empathy, but cognitive empathy can also be trained. And so you can actually develop it kind of manually over time, which is often what happens with a lot of autistic women who, like we talked about earlier, become wallflowers and they stand back and they observe and they, like Professor Atwood said, they read books soap operas. I know I got really into like the Dear Prudence columns where people would write in and ask questions and then she would give a thoughtful answer. Like I would read those obsessively when I was in high school to kind of learn about like socially normal interactions and advice giving. So you can train cognitive empathy, right? Affective empathy is the involuntary feeling of someone else's emotions. And so autistic people actually tend to have a lot of affective empathy, sometimes an overabundance to where it can become debilitating because you don't always want to involuntarily feel all the emotions of every person in the room. And it can become very confusing because, particularly when you're younger, you might not realize that those emotions are not your emotions. You are feeling someone else's emotions. And part of that is mirror neurons in the brain. They're responsible for helping us to feel what other people feel. And so when he uses, there are other types of empathy as well. Those are kind of the key ones for autistic people, though. We have a mismatch basically between level of affective empathy and level of cognitive empathy, where the affective tends to be a lot higher than cognitive. So he uses just this blanket term empathy and lumps it all together. So first of all, that's like not even good good practice within the psychology field, right? But then he yeah, he thinks it's also get so frustrated talking about him. He thinks it's also an opposite of systemizing. So, okay, stupid theory, whatever. The way that he wrote the test for it's the EQ and the SQ, it's basically two tests to see where you fall on the spectrum of both of those, is a mix of certain traits that are autistic and gendered questions, because again, he is the guy who believes in the extreme male brain theory. He's the guy that created the extreme male brain theory. So I've linked an article here where someone goes through and like does really good research and runs EQ and SQ on people and kind of shows that actually like half the questions are gender questions more than anything else. So let's think about that for a second. You have some tests here. About half the questions test autistic traits, half the questions test if you are a man. How is the scoring going to shake out? Okay, autistic men are going to score the highest on this test, then non autistic men, and then autistic women, and then non autistic women. And that is, in fact, the results that we see when you have this like weird Frankenstein blend of half autism questions and half are you man questions. But he tests it against his AQ, the test that he also wrote, and gets similar results. And so therefore he says that it's diagnostically valid, and clinicians just go along with this, which is crazy. And they don't really challenge a lot of the core premises here. And there are like many, many papers built upon this whole EQ SQ theory. That's why I was very careful about which ones I cited in this talk regarding like systemizing abilities, because a lot of them, they are giving people these tests to determine who is in the control group and who is in the autism group when they want to like learn about systemizing. And so like, yes, this test can identify autistic people. Does this test identify all autistic people? No, it identifies a very specific subset of autistic people that fit that mold that Simon Baron-Cohen has set out. And so we are going to naturally have a lot of autistic people in the control group. And so there's a lot of just like garbage science out there because they polluted the control group because this man is just so bad at writing diagnostics tests. So, okay, let's talk about a couple of the questions in the EQ and SQ, right? And I tried to pick ones that maybe pertain to Francesca a little bit. So, one of them is, I have a large collection of books, CDs, videos, etc. This is definitely an autistic thing. Again, like I noted, collections can be collections of information as well. And so it's unfortunate that he doesn't include that in the phrasing, because people, particularly autistic people who are going to be taking these questions a little bit more literally, are going to be like, well, I don't have books. I don't have a book collection. I'm going to put no. And it's like, you do have a collection of all these, like this body of knowledge about a particular interest, right? Another question is, I find myself categorizing people into types in my own mind. Uh, this is definitely an autistic trait. It's a compensatory mechanism for like if you're struggling to read people. If you stick them into categories, then it's a lot easier to kind of short circuit all the analysis that you would have to do on every individual person over and over and over all day long. Like the cognitive load of that is crazy. And so I think there's a natural tendency to categorize people and go, okay, Bob is very similar to Shirley. I'm just going to treat them similarly and in that category because I know what to do with Shirley, so I'm going to know what to do with Bob. Another one is I prefer social interactions that are structured around a clear activity like a hobby. Again, that's a very, very common autistic thing. And people in the community talk about that all the time. So these questions, not problematic. Moving on to some of the other ones, I am not interested in the details of exchange rates, interest rates, stocks, and shares. So autistic people are going to take these questions more literally. Not everyone is interested in exchange rates, right? And that tends to be a more common hobby among men. Part of that is societal conditioning, right? Like men are taught to be like the responsible money makers, right? Women were never taught that they needed to worry about money. And so naturally, more men are going to be interested in exchange rates. So that's a super gendered question. And you're also going to miss people. Another one is when I listen to a piece of music, I always notice the way it's structured. So this one, Francesca actually probably would answer yes to, but like, would you answer yes to it? Because I know I wouldn't, and that doesn't make me less autistic. It's just that, again, not everybody is interested in music. And so if you don't, you know, listen to music quite a lot, it would be very hard to pick up on the nuances of how it's structured because you just don't have that like background of knowledge. So, um, not a good question. Another one is I'm interested in knowing the path a river takes from its source to the sea. Like some people are just not into that, and that does not make them less autistic. So as you can see, some of the questions are valid and some of them are just weird, and he mixes it all together and he's creating these outcomes very artificially because of his research approach. So that's my rant for today about Simon Baron-Cohen. He lives rent free in my mind, and I need to do like whole episodes about him because he frustrates me. Okay, moving on to the very lovely moment when Francesca meets her future husband.
Good evening.
Good evening, sir. Forgive me, I was simply...
I need some quiet. I've been in search of it all night. Perhaps we can enjoy the silence together.
So this is a really lovely moment. She gets overwhelmed in this party and she dips. I love in so many scenes that she just like leaves in the middle of conversations. It's incredible. So she dips, she goes outside, and then she meets this other man who also got overwhelmed and has to dip, and they fall in love. So what's happening, right? This is like one of those things where a lot of people online were saying, "Oh, she's just introverted. Her social battery is out." No, because she very specifically talks about noise all the time. So let's talk about why that happens for autistic people. We have differences in the thalamus part of the brain. So this is the part of the brain that is responsible for basically taking in uh, sensory information. So this is from all your nerves in your body, your sense of touch, your sense of, sound, your sense of taste, like all these different senses. And then it processes it, figures out what to do with that information, right? Like if you are touching something with your hand and it feels kind of prickly, the thalamus go, "Oh, okay, we need to tell the brain to say that this is painful and pull my hand away," right? Or if you're touching something nice, you're petting your cat, and the thalamus would process that information and go, "Okay, keep doing this. This feels good. This is nice." So what they found now in functional MRIs is that we have altered thalamic activation and connectivity patterns across cortical networks. So what that means is basically neurotypicals, their thalamus is going to look a lot more. So for structural differences, it's going to look a lot more like a couple highways that'll get you from point A to point B. They're strong connections, but there's fewer. The autistic brain in this particular region is going to look a lot more like all the roads and networks inside of like a city, right? So there's lots of connections. Oftentimes when you have that overconnectivity, they're going to be weaker connections because you can sort of, again, think of it like muscles and you're not traveling any individual pathway quite as often. And so one of the theories of how autism develops in children is that you have a process called synaptic pruning that happens, I think, around like age 7, where children are born with actually too many connections, and then the weaker ones you trim away. And they think that with autistic kids, that doesn't get trimmed. We actually keep that over connectivity and we never trim the weaker connections. We're never trimming the shrubs, if you will, like in the brain. So our brains look way more connected. So what does that mean? Oh, and then there's also functional differences. They also believe that there's kind of an imbalance between GABA and glutamate. So these are neurotransmitters, and in our road analogy, you can think of them as green lights and red lights. And there's an imbalance, right? You need a balanced amount of red light time and a balanced amount of green light time for traffic flow to work. So in autistic brains, either basically not enough of one or too much of another, and these are called excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmitters. So they are exciting a response or inhibiting a response. The result is that we have too much excitatory action going all the time. So instead of having, a green light for 3 seconds and a red light for 3 seconds, the green light is just like on all the time. And so collectively, we are getting signals, we are getting sensory signals at a much louder volume than neurotypicals are. So to put it another way, you could think of it like neurotypicals are basically going their entire lives. Every beverage they have is like watered down, and ours is not watered down. We are experiencing everything, all the senses, oftentimes with more depth than they are. And certainly some people have hyposensitivity with autism, where like in particular arenas they are like less sensitive. Some autistic people don't feel pain signals, which can be concerning because then they don't know if they're like touching something hot and burning themselves. But certainly the hypersensitivity tends to be a lot more common, and that's what you see here. So she's experiencing the world a lot more in depth and a lot more intensely than neurotypicals are. And so the sound is overwhelming at a certain point. You're getting so many signals relayed in the brain without a break, without that being modulated and kind of tamped down. And she's not able to filter out extraneous sounds and extraneous signals. She's hearing everything at full volume. That's exhausting. So that's why she needs to get away. But on the flip side, that's also potentially why she has such a special interest in music, right? Is because she experiences it at a depth that other people do not. And I think that that's true for a lot of us, where fidget toys, certain foods and textures and soft things and all of our like sensory happy things, we experience it at a depth that neurotypicals do not. And so that's also a wonderful thing, right? Like that's a joyous thing that we can have these lovely, intense, happy experiences that neurotypicals don't have. So it's there are times when it's good, there are times when it's bad, but that's just the autistic brain is experiencing these things completely differently. It's experiencing the world completely differently compared to neurotypicals.
Now, high proportion of the guys here have anxiety disorders. One thing that those with Asperger's are very good at is worrying. And that level of anxiety can be generalized anxiety, phobias, often for sensory experiences like dogs barking, not going near dogs, not because they've been attacked by a dog, but they may bark, not going to birthday parties, not because of the social, because the balloons that could go pop. Not enjoying the playground because kids shouting to each other, and the shouting is aversive to that individual.
Yeah, so I definitely have sensory anxieties myself. I feel really embarrassed about it sometimes as an adult, but like they do, I live in an apartment. They do annual fire alarm testing, and it's not even like a horrible alarm. It's just like a loud voice telling you to evacuate, but it's so intense and sort of scary and unexpected for me, even if I know it's coming because, it'll go off for 10 seconds and come back on for 10 seconds, and I've tried to sit through the annual fire alarm testing and like having earplugs in, and it just is so overwhelming for me, and like I'll be shaking for the rest of the day. I get so overstimulated and scared and anxious about it that even it's interesting when they're about to do an announcement over the alarm, they'll make a popping noise, and I just am instantly filled with like fear when I hear that popping noise. And so I've had to learn, like, on fire alarm days, I have to leave the building. And I think if you were to go tell, like, a therapist that and they didn't know much about autism, someone might think that I have, like, PTSD, that I have a traumatic memory associated with fire alarms, and if I couldn't recall that, then maybe I'm, like, suppressing the memory, but in fact, sometimes it is just, with autistic people, just as straightforward as, like, the alarm itself is the trauma. It's not that it reminds me of having to evacuate a life-threatening situation or anxiety about that. Like, it truly genuinely is just the noise hurts, it scares me. I need to get out. And so it can sometimes feel a little embarrassing as an adult to be like, plugging my ears, I have to get out of here. I can't be, and I feel so bad leaving my cats behind because you can't really like bring cats out of a apartment building and, like, wait until they complete fire alarm testing, but I feel like I'm, like, abandoning them and leaving them to die. I don't think that they get as anxious about it as I do, but, like, that's how it manifests, and certainly other autistic people have sensory anxieties because sometimes it's just so overwhelming that it can, like, feel traumatic, and our brains actually do form traumatic memories differently than neurotypicals, and so sometimes that can be enough of a threshold for it to genuinely be a traumatic memory, even though it's not what you would traditionally consider trauma. But you also wouldn't want to approach it as if it was like PTSD and trying to figure out like the root cause of it or anything like that because there isn't like some deeper root cause. It's just the sensory differences. All right. So they meet at the party, they have their moment alone in silence together, and it becomes kind of an inside joke. It's a very cute inside joke. So her future husband comes over and he's calling on her. This is kind of like a Victorian era, Regency era thing where it's dating. This is how they dated basically. So this is a date but like with your parents in the same room. He also commits some social faux pas here because you're supposed to be, like, introduced before you call on someone, like, you're supposed to have a formal introduction. They had weird rules around men and women being alone together in that time period, so let's listen to the scene.
Lord Kilmartin and I met briefly at the Hawkins Ball, but have not had the opportunity for a formal introduction.
I see.
May I join you a moment?
I should like that.
She does not speak to him. I am in awe. I thought one had to use wit or banter to dissuade a suitor, but simple silence is radically more effective.
Perhaps they are enjoying themselves.
But how will they know each other if they do not speak?
So her family is just completely baffled by this, right? They just sit in silence next to each other. But this is, an inside joke for them at this point because they like being together in silence. And so this is actually a very common experience for autistic individuals, and we refer to it as parallel play. And so there was a study on this where they surveyed autistic adults about, they call it play. This is like a British study, so some of the language might sound like a little funky to Americans. They surveyed autistic adults on play styles, both as a child and as an adult. And so a lot of autistic folks said that they preferred play that involves playing nearby other people without necessarily interacting with them directly. And we also prefer to do this with other autistic people. Yes, this is a common thing. This is a thing that is starting to show up in research that autistic folks online have been talking about for forever is that concept of parallel play. And so it's just being able to sit in the room with your partner and you guys work on separate hobbies or do your separate things, but you're just alone together, quiet. It's nice. It's not overwhelming.
Enjoyable music. Yes?
If I'm being honest, no. The pace is too fickle. Just as you think you're starting to comprehend the melody, the song is over. A song like this would be far sweeter if it were played in 3/4, so one could in fact feel the music.
That is helpful. If you'll excuse me.
Lord Kilmartin, he had the music we heard earlier this week rearranged exactly as I imagined it.
So those are some of my absolute favorite scenes from the series because it's just so autistic and so sweet. So they run into each other in public and they're kind of trying to make small talk in a sort of stiff way because they're misinterpreting each other's flirting signals. And he asks her, "How do you like the music?" She gives feedback on, again, the structure of the music, and he just is like, "Thank you," and abruptly leaves, and she's offended, and she thinks he's not into her anymore. I just love how he it gets back to that monotropism again, right? His brain has a task to do, and that task is to rearrange the music the way that she imagined it, the way she described it. And so he doesn't remember to say goodbye to her or any other sort of social norm that would indicate that he's interested in her. He just goes and does it because that's, monotropism. That's what he's fixated on. And so I obviously cut out a huge chunk of stuff in there. I just cut to the happy part at the end. She thinks that he's not interested in her anymore. And then he comes up at a ball and gives her the sheet music rearrangement. And then she leaves the ball. She leaves abruptly because she becomes fixated on the sheet music and she just goes and plays it in the dark. So you remember how I said with monotropism, you're not even taking in sensory signals, right? Like when your brain is focused on something externally, you're not necessarily taking in signals from your internal body. Your proprioception is what the term would be. So I don't even know that she knows that she's playing piano in the absolute dark, but she is. She didn't bother to turn on lights. She just was so fixated that she had to go play the song that he had rearranged for her. So I just wanted, for the study for this one, I just wanted to talk again a little bit about special interests. There's kind of this misconception that special interests, and this is again, from researchers who were not autistic and were studying children and kind of drew their own conclusions. They were like, autistic special interests are a way to withdraw and be introverted. But in fact, what we know now is that special interests actually help help autistic people build relationships and connect. It can be, even though you're, focused on your interest in your activity, it can be a very social experience because the special interests themselves are a part of your identity. That's a sort of big differentiator between a hobby that a neurotypical might experience and a special interest, is that with special interest, it is central to your identity. When you are trying to understand the world, you very much process it through the lens of your special interest. And so it's kind of running in the background on your mind all day long, whatever your particular. And special interests can drift over time, and you can go through periods where you don't have a special interest, but they do tend to, on average, have longer durations. And that's kind of the lens you use to understand the world. So, and we see that, right? When her mom wants to connect with her, the mom picked this up. She uses music metaphors when she wants to explain things like that, is the lens through which Francesca is perceiving the world. And so it's not a way to withdraw. It's a part of your identity. And when you can find someone who can connect with that special interest, it's a beautiful thing. And so it's not done with the intention to disengage with other people. And for a lot of people, special interest is psychology. A lot of psychologists actually have undiagnosed, and they're starting to get more diagnosis of autism. It's very much overrepresented in the field of psychology because, gosh, what does an autistic individual who doesn't understand social cues go and do? Study it, get a PhD in social interactions, right? That's psychology. So very much doesn't match that sort of outdated perception that special interests are solitary.
Now, for the girls, yeah, they have their special interests as part of the actual syndrome, is that. Because the syndrome includes social confusion. My definition of Asperger's is very clear. It describes someone who in life has found something more interesting than socializing, but they live with social zealots. So a characteristic is, yes, the social confusion, it's routines and repetitive behavior, high levels of anxiety. So you impose routines or rituals and so on. But you have special interests. Now, that interest may last hours, it may last decades. With the boys, yeah, it's Thomas the Tank Engine and all those sorts of things. But for the girl, it may be horses. And people will say, oh, yeah, but lots of girls like horses. But it's July and she's moved the mattress into the stable. And this is so dominant. All she thinks about is horses, horses, horses. So if I want to know which kids have Asperger's in a school, I go to the librarian and I say, who's in the library at lunchtime reading about the Titanic, volcanoes, etc. For this kid, knowledge from the library, and it's an Asprey-friendly environment, or you get information from adults because they know answers to things. So as far as this person is concerned, kids my age, stupid and boring.
Yeah, so this is another reason why autistic women tend to get missed diagnostically, is because a lot of times we do have what you would call, I guess, more socially accepted special interests, right? Like horses is a really common one for autistic girls. When you look at the studies, so I showed the adult one, obviously. When you look at the studies for little girls and little boys, for children, the distribution tends to be different. So horses is a common one. It doesn't get flagged, right? Because people are like, well, all little girls are into that. So for me, one of my special interests was Disney, but it wasn't like in the normal way. Like I liked the princess movies and stuff growing up. I didn't really care for princesses though by the time I hit like middle school. I don't know. Liked the animals a whole lot better. But what I really cared about was the theme parks. And so I learned like the full history of Walt Disney, and like I could list off all these very significant dates in his life. And I cared a lot about the rides, and I was very curious about the robotics. And so I actually, this is how I got into engineering, is I wanted to be an Imagineer and design the robotics. And so it was like, how does that ride vehicle, I'd sit and watch videos like, how does that ride vehicle work? Like I was fascinated with the Indiana Jones ride, the way they have such a smooth, like it's like a on hydraulics. And then the track itself is smooth and they can use hydraulics on the upper half to simulate like going over bumpy rocks and stuff. So I'd sit and watch videos about that. I would sit and watch videos about the hotels. Like back in the day, they used to send you a DVD that had all the like 22 hotels, and I would sit and like watch the advertisement for each one and memorize the price points and the amenities and the facts about each of the Disney World hotels. And so, as I sit and describe, and I would get very frustrated with the crowd flow, like the lack of crowd flow control, because it would get very bottlenecked during parades and stuff. And I would think about like, how could you improve the crowd flow? And I'd even get annoyed with like in the women's bathrooms, you'd get a lot of backups because there'd be a bathroom that was open, but the door would look closed and nobody would go check. And I was like, how can you improve crowd flow in like the women's bathrooms at Disneyland? So, as I describe it, that's not the typical like little girl, I like princesses, I want to play with princesses. Like that's kind of a little more atypical. And certainly through that systemizing lens, because there is some validity to the idea that we approach the world more through patterns and systems. It's just unfortunate that Simon Baron-Cohen's test lumps in so many junk questions, because then you miss people when you're trying to diagnose. But there's validity to that, right? I approached the Disney fixation, even though that's a normal thing for a little girl, through that systemizing lens. So very, very common thing. And so then I wanted to show you this final thing about the cat cue. So we've been talking a lot about being a social chameleon, and this term of masking, which is where you adapt to make yourself fit in. And it's interesting because we start to see them masking together. Like it's kind of sweet, actually. they love each other. They know they love each other. Nobody else can see it. Like, other people don't understand why they're interested in each other, and her mom doesn't really accept it at first, right? And so they, try and talk it out and address it. But her husband at one of the balls notices the other people are dancing, and he sees that she's watching them dance, and he asks if she wants to dance, and she's like, "You're joking, like you're not a dancer." And he was like, "Well, maybe we should both learn to be more expressive of our love." And so I thought that was an interesting scene, and unfortunately, I couldn't find it on YouTube. It's very hard to get clips of Netflix things. We're covered under fair use doctrine, like, this is a valid use case because this is educational. Um, the other ones that, like, rip these clips and put them online are not covered under fair use doctrine, but it's quite hard to get Netflix clips in the first place. So I couldn't find anybody who had clipped that particular scene. But I thought it was interesting because I think she wanted to dance. He definitely didn't want to dance, but it's sort of performative in a way because it's to demonstrate they're a happy couple. And so they're picking up that this is a way that they can signal to the friends and the family that they're a happy couple. And so they're, like, learning how to do that together and, like, supporting each other. And then simultaneously, she feels like this is a safe space to start to unmask. So masking can have very detrimental impacts on the body. Over time, you just get exhausted. It is so draining, and this is why there are very high rates of mental health crises in autistic individuals. Like, masking is not a joke. It's something we really need to take more seriously because it can lead to some horrific outcomes for autistic individuals who have to mask their whole lives, whether that is manifests in, like, a psychiatric disorder, or it can also manifest in physical health issues. So this cat cue is actually a very good test for autistic folks. Unfortunately, I don't think it's ever used as a diagnostic in and of itself. But what happens is, a lot of times when women go into clinics these days, they will score just below sub threshold for autistic. If you have to have 25 points or whatever on the AQ, they'll score 23 or something. They're just right below. And so then doctors will administer CAT-Q. And if you score very highly on CAT-Q, then you're still considered autistic, because people who are very high masking tend to not score as highly on those tests written by Simon Baron-Cohen, because he made them really biased. So CAT-Q is kind of the antidote to Baron-Cohen, and it measures how much you mask. So just to read off a couple of those questions that I think really apply to Francesca. It's, when I'm interacting with someone, I deliberately copy their body language or facial expressions. And we do kind of see that she watches her mom a lot in these social situations. And arguably, she's also copying her older sister, Daphne, who was featured in season 1. She's trying to go through the exact same motions because she understands this is what is expected of you in the marriage mark. And so she'll just follow that same pattern. I've developed a script to follow in social situations. So this was another scene that I couldn't find, unfortunately. It's a great scene. Her fiance is trying to tell the family this sort of joke slash heartwarming story. And the first time he tries, does not do a good job. And then the two of them walk away and they regroup. And I think he, like, rehearses the joke, and then he comes back and tries again, and it comes out a lot better the second time. And so a lot of autistic people practice scripts and they rehearse what they're going to say, because then it'll feel more natural when it comes out, when the time comes. So that's a common masking one that we do see in the show. There's another one. I adjust my body language or facial expressions so that I appear interested by the person I'm interacting with. You just kind of see these, like, micro, like, she almost looks a little unsure of herself, and these micro adjustments to kind of, like, demonstrate, okay, like, I'm interested in you. In social situations, I feel like I'm performing rather than being myself. We're gonna see her talk about that in a minute here when I play this clip for you. But she very much talks about often how she can't hear her own voice in the chaos and the noise of being in the household. And if you think about being an autistic kid with, I think it's eight siblings, there are 8 total children, 8 total Bridgertons. Yeah, you would be in a social situation at all times. And so you'd have to be masking at all times. And they talk about how, she's more introverted and the family doesn't feel like they know her as well because she is constantly like withdrawing because she's tired from masking all the time around her family. So another CAT-Q question: in my own social interactions, I use behaviors that I've learned from watching other people interacting. And we see her do this in the ballroom, right? She hangs off to the side and she kind of watches other people dancing. And that's a great way to pick up how to interact in society. Number 10, I need the support of other people in order to socialize. We really see this. They do a lot better. Her and her husband do a lot better when they are together in these social environments. It's, they sort of provide emotional support for each other and like a shared understanding. So that's a really common one too. A couple more. When in social situations, I find ways to avoid interacting with others. Absolutely. We saw this already. They retreat outside. Another one, I've researched the rules of social interactions to improve my own social skills. I think we saw that a lot with Francesca because she knew what was coming for the marriage, like she knew the steps that she was going to have to go through. She had kind of already done her research and she was like, I will follow these steps. I will get a husband and that will be the end of it. I'm not going to be in society more than one season. And then in social situations, I feel like I'm pretending to be normal. Like I feel like this is pretty obvious. So let's watch the clip where she talks about sort of having to perform rather than be herself.
It is difficult sometimes to hear my own voice amidst the noise of this house. Whereas with John, I hear myself more and more. It is my great hope that the silence and beauty of Scotland will allow me to know myself better, so that you can all know me better as well. Because I want nothing more than to be close.
Yeah, so that was the clip where she's talking about her with her mom. She's going to be moving to Scotland, and not even in the major city, like rural Scotland with her husband John, because she thinks that sort of being in that solitude and that quiet, she'll be able to discover herself. And so this is a very, very common sort of unmasking thing, is like between the lack of autobiographical information and the constantly masking and trying to, sort of suppress your real self to be able to fit in society, as well as, like I talked about earlier, the high affective empathy where we absorb other people's emotions. It can be very hard to figure out who you are. Autistic people can really hit a wall where it's like, who am I? What do I even care about? What do I feel? And so I think this is beautiful that this is allowing her to be able to kind of have that self-discovery, and that she found a husband and a house and a situation where she can be away from society and she can discover herself, and they can kind of discover each other, and they can go on this journey together. And he mentioned that his family, who's also probably very autistic, does not like to go out to these social events unless they absolutely have to. They avoid socializing quite a bit. So I think that that's really lovely for her that she found family of in-laws who are going to accept her. All right. I hope that this was enough to kind of show you that Francesca Bridgerton is more likely than not autistic. Obviously, I'm not a diagnostician. I can't diagnose, and it would not be ethical to do that, even if I was with a real human person that I had not met and formally evaluated if I was a diagnostician. But she's a fictional character, and so there's really no harm here to be able to use this as a jumping off point to talk about typical autistic traits. So I hope that this was helpful for you guys to be able to understand autism a little bit more in depth. Certainly none of these singular traits would be enough to be autistic, but when you look at this constellation of struggling with social situations, being exhausted from masking, having these systemizing type special interests that are very consuming and become a part of your identity, and even struggling with recall about yourself outside of those special interests, like the autobiographical memory and differences in facial expressions and stuff. When you put all of that together, that paints a much clearer picture of someone who should probably go to a doctor and get checked out for autism. So thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope that you enjoyed this. Check out some of our other episodes about special interests. We have an episode on that, and a whole bunch of other good stuff so that you can learn more about ADHD and autism. All right, catch you later.